It's time now for the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former political advisor to both President Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Good morning, all. Al, let me just start with you. One of the more interesting things over the last couple of days is Senator Dianne Feinstein has actually made it public that at age 89, she is not going to run for re-election. And of course, we have had the announcements by the Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, and others who have reached a certain age that they're pulling out. At the same time, I think you're watching or reading the same stuff that I am. A lot of Democrats are getting kind of comfortable with the idea of Joe Biden running. And I guess the question on the table is, how do you give somebody like Joe Biden the heave-ho at this point?
Well, I think the answer is you don't give him the heave-ho, but I don't necessarily think he's going to be running. A lot of the party leaders have announced that they would support him if he ran for re-election and expect him to run. But in fact, to me, that probably makes it easier for him to, in the end, declare victory and step aside because he won't have anybody chasing him out of office. The president, I think by most standards, has had a good several months. The midterm went better than expected for the Democrats. We watched the Republicans go through 15 ballots to elect a speaker, which is sort of a century-long low in party efficiency. The State of the Union had probably, I think it's fair to say there were probably pretty low expectations for Biden, and he exceeded them. And then when the Republicans sort of misbehaved and brought their nutcase caucus to the forefront, it made it even look better than it probably was. So I don't find it surprising with him looking good, at least in the media, and that a lot of the party leaders have announced their support. In fact, I'd probably be surprised if they didn't. But let's be realistic. And here are 5 things that the last few months haven't changed. First, Biden is 80 years old and he's not going to get younger. Remember, Pelosi and Hoyer and Clyburn all stepped down right around 80. I think they were 81 for Pelosi. Second, despite that good record, his approval ratings are still in the low 40s. And presidents who run for re-election with numbers in the low 40s don't do very well. Craig and I have both worked for presidents who had that experience. Jimmy Carter for me, and George Bush for Craig. Third, about 2/3 of the rank and file say they don't want him to run. Rank and file Democrats, it's rank and file members of the party and not party leaders who pick the nominees in the end. Fourth, a presidential campaign is no less taxing after the State of the Union than it was before the State of the Union. And, it's one thing to look vigorous for a hour speech on television, and really you only have to look vigorous for 5 minutes to get that impression, and even to go out and do good vigorous events, one a day in the days after the State of the Union. But that's a lot different than surviving a months-long grueling presidential campaign. And Craig and I have both been through those, and we know that for younger people, it's pretty hard. And finally, I think the Republican candidate is less and less likely to be Donald Trump. And it's likely to be a younger, more vigorous candidate. Biden, of course, beat Trump and he wants to do it again. So, look, I think Biden has had a pretty successful first 2 years as president. And a successful presidency is a very, very good way to end 50 years in public service. Biden is uniquely positioned, I think, to declare victory and step aside. And with party leaders basically saying, we support you, there's no, it's not like anybody's trying to force him out. So I think he's, that kind of support actually makes it easier for him to step aside and pass the torch to a new generation of Democrats.
Greg, we've been talking about this for a while, but I think both of you felt that Biden was not going to run for re-election. But as we were saying, the tone in Washington is kind of a resignation that he will go for a second term. What's your thoughts?
It's definitely the tone at the moment, I would say, but for all the reasons Al mentioned, I'm still dubious. I do want to step back for a minute, and then I'll tell a campaign story. But underlying all this is, the three-letter word age, and the fact is, people are living longer. Where people who take care of themselves are living into their 80s and into their 90s. Now, that doesn't mean that along with that comes all the cognitive skill necessary to do certain things. People stop flying airplanes. People stop serving on boards of corporations. People are not selected to be chief executive officers of corporations. And so I think it's fair to ask whether there should be some kind of limit on these individuals who seem to get in and continue to hold office. Term limits are another topic for another day. I've always been somewhat dubious that there's a lot of wisdom there. But at the other end of the spectrum, having people serve for so long is, I think, becoming more and more questionable. Dianne Feinstein, whom I know and have worked with, actually was first elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors when I was in college. And trust me, I was in college a long time ago. That was in 1970, and she's continued to serve in public life. She's won all kinds of awards. She's done all kinds of good and important things. But I just think the clock has kind of run out, and there's a point at which somebody begins to lack the cognitive ability you would want them to have to represent a state or a congressional district or whatever. And I don't know whether anybody would embrace the idea of cognitive tests for people over 75 serving in public office, but I don't know why not. And actually, from the standpoint of a president's health, we checking the heart and checking other important functions is one thing. Checking their cognitive skill and making that public. The tests are taken all the time, thousands and thousands of times a day by different people. Making that known would be interesting. And if you didn't want to make it known, maybe you ought not to run. So I do think that there's some soul searching that needs to be done about how long people should do this. The story I share, and it gets back to the last point Al was making, is, George Bush ran for president, George Herbert Walker Bush ran for president in 1988, and we had climbed back up. Our numbers were pretty grim going in, but we climbed back up so that he was ahead. And I'm generally an optimist, but to be perfectly honest, I can tell you that until the last 3 or 4 days, I just couldn't really let myself, believe he was actually going to win this contest. But in those last 3 or 4 days, I was with him on the road, and we were all absolutely exhausted. And campaign headquarters, because it was still a close race, so they thought, they wanted us to go to more places, add more cities, add more stops. And I finally called Jim Baker. I said, Jim, we can't do this to this person. I mean, George Herbert Walker Bush jogged. He was in great physical shape. My fear became just having him fall right off the podium or the platform because he was so physically exhausted. And that's what modern day presidential campaigns are like. And take that on top of the fact that the press and pundits are pretty unforgiving. You know, Gerald Ford bumps his head on a helicopter and, oh my God, Gerald Ford is clumsy. Well, guess what? You know, a sitting president trips and falls, hurts themselves, falls off a bicycle. All these things have happened. But for a president who's 80 years old, those can be pretty upsetting. So I actually think for Joe Biden's sake that he ought to really carefully consider whether this is a contest he wants to go through again. And I also think the other side, one last point, and that is that these people who serve into their 80s are not opening the door for others. You know, look at Steny Hoyer, for heaven's sakes, loyal, competent, but, you know, was not going to run against the sitting speaker. Candidates in the Democratic Party would seek this office, but they have to think long and hard about running against a sitting president. So I think it's an important question for us, and I think it's a tough one for both parties. Right now, it's perhaps toughest for the Democrats.
Al, it was an interesting proposition by Mr. Fuller, a maximum age for holding office.
You know, for most of our history, we had a sort of an agreement that wasn't in law that a president would only serve 2 terms following George Washington's precedent. And then obviously Franklin Roosevelt got elected 4 times, died in office incidentally. And there were extraordinary circumstances, I'm sure, but we've decided that a president should still only be able to serve 2 terms, and now it's the law. I generally have been opposed to term limits because I believe if the voters want to elect somebody, they ought to have that right. As I get older, and I'm not quite as old as Biden, but I'll catch him pretty quick, I know that I can't do what I did 15 or 20 years ago. And so I think a limit on, an age limit on election of president probably would not be a bad idea. You know, Craig talked about that 1992 campaign, and George Bush was not near 80 years old. What was he, in his 60s or 70s, maybe? In his 60s, I think. But Bill Clinton was in his 40s. And when Craig was trying to, pull back on his schedule, Bill Clinton was on that airplane for 24 straight hours because he was younger and more vigorous. Biden might have to face that same thing. I think he should step down. I think he's had a remarkable presidency. And the other thing just about Biden, it's not the first time. 2020 wasn't the first time he sought the presidency. It really, in a sense, was the 4th. He ran in 1988 and dropped out, and then in 2008 he dropped out. Both times he got less than 1%, and he wanted to run in 2016, and Obama chose Hillary Clinton over him. So he was a guy who when I first met Biden, he was giving speeches about generational change in the 1970s and the need for it. He probably got to a point where he thought he was not going to be president. And then everything sort of, circumstances turned out that he was the perfect candidate for 2020, and he won. But I hope the people around him, if he doesn't see this himself, say, look, you've had a wonderful career. You've done unbelievable things as president. You've far exceeded any expectations, but we need to turn it over to a new generation.
Greg, you have the last word.
Brief. I think one factor that plays into all this is as you get closer to this national campaign, expectations rise. And by that, I mean, on both Republican side and Democratic side, candidates across the board want a candidate at the top of the ticket who can travel the country, who can raise money, who can build crowds. It is an unrelenting activity. And if the expectations begin to be dubious in terms of whether or not they can be met, I think you'll see other people be suggested as candidates. Other people decide maybe they'll run. Other people decide, why not get into the race? And that begins to unravel this somewhat. So I think those expectations are going to be harder to meet as time goes on for the incumbent president, and also for our Republican potential challenger down in Florida. In his case, I do hope he steps aside sooner rather than later.
Craig Fuller, Al Fromm, thank you so much indeed. We will see you next week.